Clara Whitmore did not weep at her wedding. She stood straight, gloves folded at her wrists, while Nathaniel Ashford signed the marriage register without once looking at her face, and when the ink was barely dry, he turned and walked out of the church door, as if he had simply finished a transaction that had required his signature and nothing more. The carriage that took her away did not go to his Boston house. It carried her north, toward a locked estate no one had lived in for 7 years, and Clara pressed her hand flat against the cold carriage window and made herself one promise, not a prayer, not a wish, a promise the only kind she trusted: I will not disappear for anyone. If this story speaks to something you have been carrying, subscribe to this channel and follow Clara all the way to the end, because what she does next is not what anyone expected, least of all herself. The carriage rolled through the iron gate at 4:30 in the afternoon, and Ashford Hollow sat at the end of a long gravel drive flanked by oaks, so overgrown their branches had nearly sealed the sky above the road. The house was 3 stories of dark brick and shuttered windows, every shutter sealed tight, as if the building had decided years ago that it wanted no more light, and had enforced that decision with the patience of something that did not expect to be argued with. The front steps were cracked. The brass door knocker had gone green. A loose shutter on the 2nd floor swung once in the warm July wind, and the hollow wooden sound it made against the frame was the only greeting she received. The coachman set her trunk on the gravel without ceremony, handed her a sealed letter, said only that Mrs. Reed would receive her, and drove away. Clara stood alone with one trunk and a letter from a man who had already demonstrated clearly and efficiently exactly what he thought of her. She broke the wax seal. The letter was 3 sentences. Mrs. Ashford, Ashford Hollow is at your disposal. Mrs. Reed will show you the household accounts. I will be in Boston until further notice, no signature, not even his initial. Clara folded the letter, slid it into her coat pocket, and picked up her own trunk. She did not stand there. She did not allow herself the indulgence of feeling what the moment was. She picked up the trunk and walked to the door, because standing still and feeling things had never once solved a problem she was aware of. The woman who opened the front door was perhaps 60, small-framed, with iron-grey hair pulled back severely and eyes that catalogued Clara from hem to hat brim in roughly 4 seconds. Mrs. Reed, the housekeeper, whose expression made it clear. She had been told to expect a new Mrs. Ashford and had formed her own conclusions about what that was going to mean, showed Clara the house with the efficiency of a woman who has made peace with an unpleasant assignment. The inside of Ashford Hollow was dark in the way that old grief is dark, not absence of light exactly, but a heaviness that had settled so long it had become structural. Holland covers draped over the parlor furniture. A grandfather clock in the hallway had stopped at 11 minutes past 8, and no one had seen fit to wind it in 7 years. Dust lay across the mantel shelf in a layer thick enough to write your name in, and Clara suspected if she tried she would find other names already there, written by other hands in other seasons and never wiped away. The household staff, Mrs. Reed informed her in a tone that communicated she did not expect to be questioned, consisted of herself, Samuel the groundskeeper's boy, Dora who managed the kitchen, and William who saw to the horses. That is all, Mrs. Reed said. That is all for this size of house. Mr. Ashford did not see a need for more. Clara looked at the staircase, at the banister that was beautiful walnut work, but had a section of carpet pulled loose from its rod on the 3rd step that no one had bothered to tack back down, and she said nothing, because she was beginning to understand that this house was not simply neglected. It was a portrait of a man who had stopped seeing what was in front of him, and that was a different kind of problem entirely. Her rooms were on the 2nd floor, east-facing, which meant they would catch the morning light if anyone ever opened the shutters. No one had. The bedroom was clean enough, because Mrs. Reed kept a clean house whatever else might be said of the situation, but the room felt provisional in the way of a space, prepared for someone whose stay is not expected to matter. The bed was made with plain white linen. There was a writing desk with no paper on it, a fireplace that had not been laid, a wardrobe with bare shelves, and no vanity mirror. Clara set her trunk down, opened it herself, and began unpacking with the methodical attention she brought to everything. She had 4 dresses, 2 dishes, her sewing kit, her mother's Bible, a small leather journal she had been writing in since she was 16, and a folded piece of paper on which she had copied out the Massachusetts statutes governing married women's property rights. She always kept that page. She kept it the way other women kept photographs. Not for comfort, but for the knowledge that the law was specific about what she did and did not have, and that knowing the edges of a thing was always better than pretending the edges were not there. She hung her dresses, placed the Bible on the nightstand, set the journal and the folded statutes side by side on the writing desk, then stood back and looked at the room. "All right," she said quietly to no one. "Let's begin." She ate dinner alone in the kitchen that first night, because the formal dining room had been shut so long that Mrs. Reed looked genuinely alarmed when Clara suggested opening it. "Mr. Ashford doesn't," she began, and Clara said, "Mr. Ashford isn't here," not unkindly, and accepted the bowl of soup Dora placed in front of her with a nod of thanks that made Dora blink, because it was not the kind of acknowledgement the kitchen staff had been receiving from that direction of the house for 7 years. "I know this isn't what you expected," Clara said to Mrs. Reed, sitting at the kitchen work table with the same composure she would have brought to a drawing room. "You expected a woman who would spend a week crying and then return to wherever she came from. I understand that. I might have expected the same thing." Mrs. Reed said nothing, "And yet here I am," Clara said and lifted her spoon. "The accounts after supper, Mrs. Reed. I mean it." The household accounts were a portrait of slow strangulation, and Clara sat with 3 ledger books spread open under the lamp and read every entry twice. Mrs. Reed sat across from her, arms folded, watching with an expression that shifted over the course of an hour from suspicion to something more carefully neutral. The numbers told a story, not a complete one. Too many pages had been maintained at the surface level with the appearance of proper expenditure, but there were threads. Payments to Boston suppliers running 15% above comparable market costs. A quarterly estate management fee paid to a firm called Harrow and Associates, for which Clara could find no signed contract anywhere in the books. Timber sales from the North Acreage, showing receipts at less than half the current Massachusetts market rate for the documented volume. "Mrs. Reed," Clara said without looking up, "how long has Harrow and Associates been collecting this management fee?" Silence. Clara looked up. Mrs. Reed's face had gone very still. 4 years, near enough," she said. "Who authorized it? It was in place when I arrived. I assumed Mr. Ashford. Did you ever see a contract?" Another silence, longer. "No." Clara looked back at the numbers, then pulled her journal toward her and began copying the figures in her careful, precise hand. "I am not accusing anyone in this house," she said. "Whatever is happening here happened before you, and likely before everyone still employed in this household." "But you think something is happening," Mrs. Reed said. "I think," Clara said, closing the first ledger and opening the second, "that someone has been very patient and very quiet and very confident that no one would ever look too closely at this estate." She wrote another number. Then she looked at Mrs. Reed directly. They miscalculated. What the story about Clara circulating through Boston society's drawing rooms in the first week of the marriage did not include was any of this. Because the people spreading that story had no interest in the truth of what was happening inside Ashford Hollow, and every interest in the story that served them better. In the version moving through the better households on Beacon Hill, Nathaniel Ashford had been practically coerced into the marriage by the creditor associations attached to the Whitmore family name, a name that had once been respectable before old Daniel Whitmore had managed to lose nearly everything in a failed shipping venture. The new Mrs. Ashford was described as plain, desperate, 26 years old with no prospects, who had clung to the Ashford connection because she had nothing else left to hold. Vivian Harrow told this version best. She had a gift for narrative, for trimming it precisely, smoothing away the parts that generated sympathy and sharpening the parts that generated contempt, and she told it over tea with her particular brand of bright, sorrowful candor that made listeners feel they were being confided in rather than positioned. Of course Nathaniel felt some obligation, Vivian said, setting down her teacup with the gentle authority of a woman who had spent 3 years positioning herself as the natural second wife and had watched an inconvenient conscience intervene at the last moment. He's given her a house and a title. She ought to be grateful, though I understand she's already making a nuisance of herself with ledgers. What would a woman like that know about estate accounts? And across the table, her cousin nodded, and Vivian reached for another biscuit, and she was not worried because she had been watching Nathaniel Ashford for years, and she believed she understood exactly what he would and would not do, and she was counting on him to stay away. Clara had been at Ashford Hollow 11 days when she found the garden, not because it was hidden, but because 7 years of untended growth had reclaimed it so completely that it registered as wilderness rather than intention. She found it while walking the north fence line to understand the property's acreage, stepped through a gap in an overgrown private hedge, and found herself standing in what had once been a formal kitchen garden. Stone paths still existed beneath the weeds. A central well was choked with climbing vine. Against the south wall, a row of apple trees that had once been trained and productive had grown wild and graceless, their disciplined shapes long gone to tangle, but they were alive. Every single one of them. Clara stood very still in the middle of it and felt something she had not felt since the carriage brought her through those iron gates. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that underneath the neglect there was structure, that the bones of something good were still here, and that bones were enough to start with. Samuel appeared around the hedge, the 17-year-old groundskeeper's boy who had been following her at a respectful distance for half an hour without announcing himself, and looked at his boots when she pointed out that he had known this was here all along. "Mr. Ashford said to leave it," he said. Clara looked at the apple trees, at the new growth pressing through the tangle, green and persistent, after 7 years of being left behind. "Samuel," she said. "Ma'am, do you know how to prune?" He looked up. "My father taught me," he said, and stopped, because there was something he wasn't saying about his father, and Clara heard the stop and did not press it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I know how." "Good," Clara said, and pushed up her sleeves. "Then we have work to do." But here is what Clara did not let anyone see in those first weeks, because she was a precise woman who understood that showing uncertainty was a cost she could not yet afford. There were nights, after Mrs. Reed's footsteps had faded down the hall, and Dora's kitchen fire had gone quiet, and the stopped clock in the hallway held its frozen hour like a wound that had refused to close. When Clara sat at the writing desk with her journal open and the Massachusetts property statutes unfolded beside it, and she looked at those 2 documents side by side and felt the weight of what she had walked into. She had promised herself she would not disappear. She had not promised it would be easy. On the 9th night, she wrote a single line in her journal and then closed it and did not read it again for weeks. She wrote, "I do not know if I am protecting an estate or simply refusing to admit that no one wants me here." It was the most honest thing she had written since arriving. It was also, she decided by morning, the last indulgence she was going to allow herself on the subject, because the numbers in those ledgers did not care what she felt. And someone had been counting on no one feeling anything strongly enough to look. By the end of the 2nd week, the east parlor was open, the Holland covers removed, the windows thrown wide to let in July heat and the smell of grass, and Dora had beaten the rugs until the dust came out in clouds. Mrs. Reed watched the process with the expression of a woman who had decided to suspend judgment until she had more evidence. The evidence was accumulating. Clara did not sleep past 6. She rose before the household, dressed without assistance, and was at the kitchen table with her journal and ledger copies before Dora had the first fire lit. She learned the names of every servant within 3 days. She asked Samuel about the roof, the well water, the year the north fence had last been reposted. She asked Dora about kitchen suppliers and reliable merchants in the nearest town. She asked William about the horses and the carriage axle that rode rough on the right side. William said he hadn't had the repair budget to see to it. Clara wrote that down. She wrote everything down because she had understood from the beginning that the difference between a woman who is dismissed and a woman who cannot be dismissed is documentation. One morning near the end of the 2nd week, Mrs. Reed came to the kitchen at 6:30 and found Clara already there, and instead of going to the opposite end of the table and sitting with her arms folded in the posture she had maintained for 12 days, Mrs. Reed pulled out the chair directly across from Clara and sat down and said, "The dining room curtains are salvageable if we take them down and beat them properly. I wanted you to know." Clara looked at her over the top of the ledger. "Thank you, Mrs. Reed." A long pause. "The missing funds," Mrs. Reed said. "I've been thinking about it. There's something else you should see." She placed a folded document on the table between them. It was a letter, 3 years old, written on Harrow and Associates stationery, addressed to a property agent in Boston, discussing the potential acquisition of the north acreage of an estate in rural Massachusetts, whose current owner was described as disengaged from management. The estate was Ashford Hollow. The disengaged owner was Nathaniel Ashford. Clara read it twice, then placed it flat on the table and pressed both hands on it as if to hold it still. "Where did you find this?" "Back of the linen cupboard," Mrs. Reed said, "behind the Christmas tablecloths. I don't know how it got there. I don't know if Mr. Ashford ever saw it." Clara looked at the letter. "Someone has been planning to take this estate," she said, "not steal it outright, but drain it slowly, undervalue it, document it as a failing property, and then purchase it when the owner finally lets go." "Yes," Mrs. Reed said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the early morning light. "He's not going to let go," Clara said. Mrs. Reed blinked. "Not while I'm here," Clara added, and folded the letter into her journal between the pages of property statutes. "Someone has been counting on his absence. Someone has been very carefully making sure he stays disengaged and never looks too closely at these numbers." She closed the journal. "I looked closely," she said, "and I intend to keep looking. If you are finding value in this story, this is the moment to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because what happens next is not just about one woman and one estate. It is about the particular kind of courage that does not announce itself." The letter from Vivian Harrow arrived on the 19th day, addressed to the current occupant of Ashford Hollow, which told Clara everything about the sender before she broke the seal. The letter was gracious in the way that a blade is gracious, sharp and precise, and intended to enter cleanly. Vivian introduced herself as a close friend of the Ashford family and offered guidance regarding Boston society and the estate's proper social obligations, and in the second paragraph suggested, with warmth that had the texture of warning, that Clara consider the wisdom of discretion in all matters pertaining to the estate, as some things were better left to those with longer familiarity with the family's affairs. Clara read it to the end. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. "Dora," she said. The cook looked over from the stove. "Do we have good writing paper?" "Yes, ma'am, in the desk in the east parlor. You had me find it last week? Good." Clara folded Vivian's letter and placed it in the journal next to the property acquisition letter and the copied ledger figures. She was building something, page by page and number by number, and she could feel it taking shape the way an argument takes shape, when the evidence is finally sufficient to carry the weight of what it needs to prove. She went back to the accounts. The 28 apple trees had survived 7 years. She had counted them that morning, everyone still alive, still pressing new growth through the chaos of neglect. Some things refused to give up. She intended to be one of them. The 31st morning at Ashford Hollow began the same way the previous 30 had. Clara at the kitchen table before sunrise with the ledger open and the journal beside it, and Dora's fire crackling to life in the stove while the rest of the house still slept. But something had shifted overnight, and Clara felt it the moment she opened the North Acreage accounts again. She had been adding the timber receipts column 3 different ways for 4 days, and every time she arrived at the same number. The receipts logged for the past 3 years showed sales of approximately 40 cords of hardwood annually from the North Acreage. 40 cords at current Massachusetts market rates should have produced a specific amount. What had actually been deposited into the Ashford Hollow operating account was less than half that figure. Season after season, year after year, the difference going somewhere, and that somewhere had a name printed neatly at the top of a property acquisition letter currently tucked inside Clara's journal. She underlined the final sum twice and set down her pen. "Dora," she said. Dora looked up from the bread she was working. "When Harrow and Associates sends their quarterly invoice, what form does it come in?" "A sealed envelope, ma'am," Dora said. "Addressed to the estate account, not to Mr. Ashford personally. Always has been. And who opens estate account correspondence? Mrs. Reed, mostly. Has Mr. Ashford ever opened one himself?" Dora thought about it, genuinely thought, not performed consideration. "Not that I ever saw, ma'am. He hasn't been here for the quarterly billing in." She stopped. "In a long time," Clara finished. She picked up her pen and wrote, "Correspondence routed away from principal, 4 years minimum." Someone had built this very carefully, the kind of careful that assumes it will never be examined. She was examining it. She wrote to Judge Elias Monroe, the family's legal man of record, whose name she had found in the original estate incorporation documents from 1797. The letter took her 3 drafts. The first was too formal. The second was too deferential. The third she wrote the way her father had taught her to write when they still had enough money for him to be teaching her anything, plainly, specifically, with every important fact presented before the request, so that the request appeared not as a petition, but as an obvious logical conclusion. She laid out the uncontracted Harrow payments, the below-market timber receipts, the acquisition letter, and she asked for guidance regarding the proper legal procedures for investigating potential mismanagement of estate funds under Massachusetts statute. She sealed it herself and gave it to William to post. Then she went back to work, because there was nothing to do but work, and the work was the only thing she could control. And Clara had understood since she was 16 years old that controlling what you could control was not small, it was the whole of the thing. The boundary posts came next, pulled from the north fence line on a Thursday afternoon, 3 of them, not fallen, not rotted, extracted deliberately. The ground around the holes disturbed in the specific way that ground is disturbed when something is removed with intention. Samuel found them and came to Clara in the garden, moving faster than his usual deliberate pace, and she followed him to the north boundary and saw exactly what he meant. "Someone wants this line to look disputed," she said. "If the fence posts are missing, the boundary becomes harder to prove without survey records. And if the boundary is disputed," she stopped, then asked, "Samuel, where are the original property survey documents for this estate?" He didn't know. "Ask Mrs. Reed tonight," Clara said. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." She pulled a measuring cord from her work apron pocket and began marking the positions of the missing posts with field stones, noting each measurement against a rough sketch she made in her journal on the spot. If someone wanted this line to look uncertain, she was going to make certain it looked like anything but. The survey documents were in the house, in a locked chest in the library, inside a box whose key was on a ring with 6 others hanging in the back of the estate key cabinet. Documents from 1797, original, signed, stamped, clearly establishing every boundary of Ashford Hollow's 240 acres in specific and unmistakable terms. Clara rolled them carefully, wrapped them in oilcloth, and put them in the chest in her bedroom. "From now on, they're in my room," she told Mrs. Reed. Then she asked, "Over the past 4 years, have there been any visitors to the estate with a reason to be inside this house?" Mrs. Reed thought carefully. "2 years ago," she said slowly, "a man who said he was from the county assessor's office. He came to review the property records. I let him into the library." Clara looked at the empty space in the chest where the survey roll had lived. "He would have found them," she said. "He just didn't take them because taking them would have been noticed. He only needed to know they existed." She locked the chest and put the key on a chain around her neck. "No one enters this library without me present," she said. "Not for any reason." Gerald Pratt arrived on a Tuesday in early August, 40-ish, well-dressed in the Boston merchant style, carrying himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone he considered worth hearing it from. He asked for Mr. Ashford. When William said Mr. Ashford was not in residence, he asked for the estate agent. When William said there was no estate agent currently in residence, Pratt asked to speak to whoever was managing the property and was shown to the east parlor, where Clara received him standing. She did not invite him to sit. Pratt looked around the open, cleaned room, the uncovered furniture, the open windows, the fresh herbs in a clay pot on the side table, with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "I represent Harrow and Associates." "I know who you represent, Mr. Pratt." He tried the gracious approach, suggesting the accounts might look irregular to a fresh set of eyes, and Clara let him finish, and then she told him precisely what she had. Every ledger entry copied and documented, the discrepancy in the timber receipts, the quarterly fees without a contract, and her correspondence with Judge Monroe's office. Pratt's smile did not disappear, but something behind it did. He suggested she speak with her husband before taking actions that could complicate established relationships. "My husband sent me here to manage this household," Clara said. "I am managing it. If Harrow and Associates has a legitimate contract with this estate, I'll expect a copy delivered here within the week. If no contract exists, the quarterly payments will cease immediately, and Judge Monroe will receive a full account of the discrepancies." She did not see him out. William showed him to the door. Mrs. Reed appeared in the parlor doorway approximately 4 seconds after the front door closed. "I was in the hall," she said. "I know," Clara said. "He came from Harrow." Mrs. Reed crossed her arms, then uncrossed them. "What will they do next?" "Something faster than they've been moving," Clara said. "They've been patient for 4 years because no one was looking. Now someone is looking, and patience is going to start costing them more than they budgeted for." She picked up her pen and went back to work. "Mrs. Reed," she said without turning around, "Ma'am, make sure the front door is locked at night from now on. All the windows on the ground floor, too." A pause. "Yes, ma'am," Mrs. Reed said, and for the first time, the title did not sound like a question. Harrow's response came through the post. A legal-sized envelope containing a single page, informing Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford that Harrow and Associates had been managing certain interests of the Ashford estate under a verbal agreement with Mr. Ashford himself, and that any alterations to existing estate management arrangements would require his written authorization. Clara read it at the kitchen table, while Dora made breakfast and Mrs. Reed sat across from her waiting. "Verbal agreement," Clara said. "That's what it says," Mrs. Reed confirmed. "No signatures, no documentation. 4 years of payments for a verbal agreement." Clara set the letter down. "That's not a contract, that's a story. They're betting he won't give written authorization because they've been managing him for 4 years by keeping him away and keeping him uninterested." She stood up. "I need to write to him." Mrs. Reed looked startled. "To Mr. Ashford?" Yes, Clara was already moving toward the east parlor desk. I've avoided it because I didn't want to seem like I was asking for rescue. I am not asking for rescue. I am telling him what is happening to his estate and giving him the opportunity to act on it. She sat at the desk and pulled out clean paper. There is a difference, she said mostly to herself, between needing a man to save you and choosing to tell him the truth. She wrote the letter in one draft. She sealed it herself. She gave it to William with instructions to ride to Boston directly. Then she went back to work, because what else was there to do? His response came 4 days later, in a hand she had not seen before, direct and unornamented, the handwriting of a man who wrote quickly and did not think much about how the letters looked. Mrs. Ashford, I have received your account of the estate records. I will be at Ashford Hollow within a fortnight. N. Ashford. Clara read it once, folded it, set it on the desk. She told herself clearly that she had written the letter as a professional communication regarding estate concerns, and that was the frame she intended to hold. He was coming because of the estate. That was appropriate. That was correct. She had not written the letter because she wanted him to come. She believed this almost entirely, but she found herself that afternoon in the garden asking Samuel to start on the south wall apple trees, the ones that were furthest along, the ones already beginning to show what they would be once they had room to grow properly, and she did not examine her reasons for that particular choice. She simply picked up the shears and went to work. The house, which had been breathing steadily for over a month, kept breathing, windows open, fires lit at evening, the smell of Dora's bread moving through the halls, the sound of Samuel's pruning work drifting in from the garden. Ashford Hollow was not yet transformed. It was not what it had been, but it was alive again in a way it had not been for 7 years. And Clara stood at the east window in the early evening and looked at the south wall where the apple trees were beginning. Very slowly, with the particular stubbornness of things that have been neglected but not destroyed, to show their shape. She had 14 days before Nathaniel Ashford walked through that door. She intended to use every one of them. The 14th day arrived the way significant days often do without announcement, looking exactly like the 13 that came before it. Clara was in the garden when she heard the carriage on the gravel drive. She did not run inside to change her dress. She did not pull off her work gloves and smooth her hair and arrange herself into something more presentable. She finished tying the apple branch she was working on, secured the knot, and walked through the garden gate and around the side of the house at a pace that was neither hurried nor deliberately slow. Nathaniel Ashford was stepping down from the carriage, and she looked at him for the first time with actual attention, because at the church she had made herself look at his hands, and the set of his jaw and the door he walked out of, and had not permitted herself a portrait of the man. She was getting one now. He was taller than she remembered, lean in the way of men who do physical work rather than desk work, with a coat that was good quality but not fussy. He carried no hat. His hair was dark, and his face had once been open and had been closed by something, and had been closed long enough that the closing had become the default expression. He was looking at the house. He stood still for a long moment looking at it, and Clara watched him register that the shutters were open, all of them, every window on the front face of the house catching the afternoon light instead of blocking it. And the house looked like a house that had people in it, people who intended to stay. Something moved across his face that she could not name precisely, and it passed quickly. And then he turned and saw her standing 15 feet away in a work dress with garden dirt on her gloves. "Mr. Ashford," Clara said, "Mrs. Ashford." His voice was lower than she had registered at the church. He took her in the same way she had taken him in, direct and thorough, and without apology for the looking. "You're in the garden," he said. "I was," she said. "I heard the carriage." She pulled off her work gloves. "I wasn't told to expect you today specifically. Your letter said a fortnight. Your letter said within a fortnight. Today is the 14th day. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. Within and on are different things. Generally, yes, she said, and tucked the gloves into her apron pocket. Mrs. Reed has your rooms prepared. Dora will have supper at 7, if that suits you. She said it the way a competent household manager says it, informatively, without warmth or coldness, as a statement of what the house was prepared to provide. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the house again. The shutters, he said. I opened them, she said. The rooms needed light. She met his gaze directly. If that was a mistake, you can tell me so plainly. He did not tell her it was a mistake. He picked up his traveling case and walked toward the front steps. 7 o'clock, he said. 7 o'clock, Clara confirmed. She went back to the garden. Her hands were perfectly steady. Supper that night was the strangest meal Clara had eaten since arriving at Ashford Hollow. The dining room, now fully restored, curtains rehung, table polished, candles lit at both ends, looked the way it was meant to look, and Mrs. Reed had outdone herself, and the food was good, roasted chicken and early corn from the kitchen garden and Dora's bread. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table. Clara sat at the opposite end. The distance between them was approximately 8 feet of cherry wood and 7 years of absence, and an entire architecture of things neither of them had said yet. He ate without commenting on the food. She ate without commenting on his silence. Then, midway through the meal, he set down his fork. You said in your letter there were irregularities in the accounts, he said. Yes, how long have you been tracking them? Since the 3rd day I was here. He looked at her. The 3rd day. The household accounts were the first thing I asked to see. Something in the numbers didn't sit correctly. I've been working through it since. And what did you find? Clara set down her own fork. She had prepared for this conversation the way she'd prepared for everything, methodically, with enough specificity that she could not be dismissed as a woman who had misread a column or misunderstood a figure. She told him about the 4 years of uncontracted quarterly payments, the below-market timber receipts, the acquisition letter from the linen cupboard, the fence posts pulled from the north boundary line, the survey documents now secured in her room. She kept her voice level throughout. She presented the evidence and let it speak. Nathaniel was very still by the time she finished. The survey documents, she continued, were still in the library. I've secured them. I've also been in correspondence with Judge Monroe's office, who has confirmed the discrepancies are worthy of legal review. Silence, you wrote to Monroe, he said. I needed to understand the legal protections available to the estate. I did not ask for his direct intervention. I asked for information. How did you know to contact Monroe? His name was on the original estate incorporation documents from 1797. He's the family's legal man of record. She picked up her fork again. I did read everything in that library, Mr. Ashford. All of it. Another silence, different in texture from the first. Harrow, he said, and the word came out flat and contained in the way words come out when a man is working to keep a larger reaction. Yes, Clara said. Vivian Harrow's family firm. She has been managing the social narrative from Boston. Her family has been managing the financial end. They work together quite effectively. Nathaniel put down his fork. He looked at the candle in the center of the table, like a man who had just been told something he half knew and had been not knowing deliberately, and Clara recognized what that looked like, because she had watched her father do it for 5 years while the money ran out, and she had promised herself she would never do it herself, and she had kept that promise at considerable cost. The candle burned between them, and outside the summer night was warm and full, and the windows Clara had opened were letting in the sound of crickets and the smell of the garden. He stayed. He moved through the house with the careful step of a man relearning a space he had thought he was finished with. On the second morning, he found the east parlor and stood in the doorway, looking at the uncovered furniture and the open windows and the herbs on the side table, and said nothing for so long that Clara finally looked up from the desk. Is there something you need? No. He looked at the window. My mother had herbs in here in pots like that. Samuel's from the kitchen garden, Clara said. I've been trying to catalogue what's surviving in there, he said quietly. I didn't know anything was surviving. 28 apple trees, Clara said. All of them. And the herb beds are coming back if you give them room. He looked at her for a moment, then walked away, and she heard his boots on the stairs, heard him on the second floor walking the length of the hall, pausing at various points in the way a man pauses when he is measuring the distance between what he remembers and what he finds. Mrs. Reed appeared in the parlor doorway. He went upstairs, she said. I heard him. He hasn't been upstairs in this house in 4 years, not when he came for the accounts. Mrs. Reed's voice was careful. The last time he was here upstairs, it was 2. She stopped, and Clara finished, closed the house after his wife died. Yes. Clara set down her pen. She looked at the ceiling as if she could see through it to wherever Nathaniel was standing in the hall above. Let him walk, she said. What Clara did not say, and did not write in her journal that night, was the thing she had been carrying since she found the garden, and looked at those 28 surviving trees, and understood that there is a particular loneliness in being alive in a place where no one expects you to be alive. She had been thinking about Eleanor Ashford more than she had intended to. She had been thinking about what it meant to step into a house where another woman's hands had trained those apple trees and chosen those herbs, and stood at the back window in the morning while her husband watched from inside. Clara was not Eleanor. She knew she was not Eleanor, but she also knew she was living in Eleanor's bones, tending Eleanor's garden, opening Eleanor's rooms, and that the man upstairs was walking the hall where Eleanor had walked, and that some part of what was happening in this house was not just an estate being revived, but a grief being finished. And she was not certain what her place was in that finishing. She sat with that uncertainty, the way she sat with all difficult things, quietly, at the writing desk, with the lamp burning low, and she let it be true without trying to resolve it before it was ready to be resolved. He found the ledger copies on the 3rd day and read them for 20 minutes with the focused stillness of a man who has just understood that he has been stupid about something for a very long time. She sat across from him and waited. Then he said, without looking up, "Walk me through this." She walked him through it. She was precise. She did not editorialize. She presented the numbers and the documents and the sequence of events the same way she would have presented them to Judge Munro, with full information and without the inflection of grievance. When she finished, he said, 4 years at minimum. She said, the earliest irregular payment I can document is 4 years ago, but the acquisition letter is 3 years old, which suggests the relationship predates the formal payment arrangement. They were planning it before the payment started. The payments may have been how they kept the plan moving once they had established that you were unavailable. He looked at the word, unavailable. You were grieving, Clara said. They used it. That is not a failure of your grief, Mr. Ashford. It is a failure of their character. He looked at her. You didn't have to do any of this, he said. No, she agreed. I could have sat in the cold bedroom and waited to be retrieved. That didn't seem particularly useful. And she said, I am not most women. She said it without heat. It was simply a fact, and the house needed someone to look after it. You weren't here, so I was. He looked down at the ledger. I should have been here, he said, but this time it came out differently. Not as an acknowledgement of failure directed at her, but as something he was saying to the room, to the house, to the 7 years of absence he had let accumulate around him like walls. Clara said nothing. She let it sit. Some things needed room to land. The letter from Vivian arrived on the 5th day of Nathaniel's stay, addressed to him this time, and Clara saw it on the post and took her own correspondence and left him to his. She was in the garden when he found her. You've seen Vivian's letters, he said. She wrote to me twice, Clara said, not looking up from the rosebed. Both are in the journal with the other documents. What did they say? The first was a social introduction, suggesting I direct any questions about the estate to people with longer familiarity with Ashford affairs. The second suggested I keep you informed of my activities. She finally looked up. They were threats in the grammar of social advice. Nathaniel stood with Vivian's letter held loosely at his side, his jaw tight. "What does hers say?" Clara asked. "If it's relevant to the estate, I need to know." He looked at her for a moment, then held it out. She read it, standing in the garden. Vivian had written that she hoped whatever Clara had been filling Nathaniel's head with hadn't alarmed him unduly, that new women in a household often mistook ordinary business arrangements for impropriety from inexperience, and that she would be at the Bradford estate in Concord through the end of the month if he wanted to speak privately, before taking any actions based on incomplete information. Clara read it twice, then handed it back. "She doesn't know you've seen the ledgers," Clara said. "She thinks you've only heard my account of them. She thinks she can offer you her version, and you'll take it. She's been confident of that for 4 years. Clara paused. She has reason to be. It's worked before. It was the most direct thing she had said to him about the 7 years, and she saw it land, saw him absorb it without flinching, which she respected. "It won't work this time," he said. "No," Clara said. "It won't." She turned back to the rosebed. "Don't go to Concord, Mr. Ashford. Write to Judge Monroe instead. Ask him to come here." "You're not going to ask me why I ever trusted her. That's not my business," Clara said. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name, just her name, not her title. She stilled. "Ask me," he said. "You've earned the right." She turned and looked at him and thought about it genuinely, thought about whether she wanted to open that particular door, what was behind it, what it would cost both of them to walk through it. "After," she said. "After Monroe comes and the documents are reviewed," and she held his gaze. "The estate first. Then we can talk about the rest." He looked at her for a long moment. The garden was warm around them, the apple trees putting out their slow recovered growth along the south wall. "All right," he said. He went inside to write to Monroe. Judge Elias Monroe arrived 8 days later with 2 attorneys from Boston and the unhurried bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades understanding exactly what people were trying to hide from him. He shook Clara's hand before he shook Nathaniel's, which told her something about what her correspondents had communicated. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "your letters were among the most precisely documented communications I have received in 30 years of practice." "The numbers made it straightforward," Clara said. "The numbers are never straightforward," Monroe replied. "The skill is in knowing which numbers to read." They spent the first day in the library, Clara laying out everything in the sequence she had assembled, walking Monroe and his attorneys through the timeline the same way she had walked Nathaniel, and she watched Monroe's face become very still in the way judges' faces become still when they are doing the internal calculus of how serious a thing is. "The boundary fence," he said at one point, "pulled from 3 sections on the north acreage line. I marked the post positions with field stones before replacing them," Clara said. "The measurements are in that page of the journal." Monroe looked at the page, handed it to one of his attorneys, and said, "Survey the line tomorrow against the 1797 documents." "The acquisition letter," Monroe said, and Clara produced the letter, and Monroe took it and read it once and set it down on the table very carefully, the way you set down things that are both fragile and dangerous. "This," he said to Nathaniel, "is not a misunderstanding. This is a coordinated effort to deprive you of estate assets through financial manipulation and an attempt to establish a boundary dispute for future land acquisition. It involves at minimum the Harrow family's business interests and likely 2 or 3 other parties we haven't identified yet." "Can it be proven?" Clara asked. Monroe looked at her. "The payments without a contract constitute recoverable funds. The timber receipts below market rate suggest collusion with the buyer. The acquisition letter is the most significant piece." He looked at Nathaniel. Do you have any record of authorizing a verbal agreement with Harrow and Associates? No, Nathaniel said. None. Then they have no legal standing for a single payment. Monroe closed the journal. The recovery process will take time. But yes, Mrs. Ashford, it can be proven. Clara sat back. She had been carrying the weight of knowing for 6 weeks, carrying it carefully, carrying it alone, and now the weight shifted. Not disappeared, but shifted, and she felt the difference between those two things in a way she had not anticipated. There's one more thing, she said. Vivian Harrow is currently at the Bradford estate in Concord. She wrote to Mr. Ashford 5 days ago, suggesting he visit her privately before taking any action. She doesn't know the extent of what we have. I believe she still thinks this can be managed socially. Monroe read the letter. A small, tight expression moved across his face that was not quite satisfaction. She'll find out otherwise, he said. When Clara said, she'll move quickly. She's been patient for 4 years. When patience stops working, she won't be patient anymore. Monroe looked at Clara with the full attention of a man reassessing what he is looking at. How did you know? He said. Which thread to pull first? Clara looked at the table full of documents, 6 weeks of work laid out in order, telling the story she had assembled page by careful page from the evidence hiding in plain sight inside this house. I've been managing accounts since I was 16, she said. My father's business kept its records in the same kind of ledger. I know what honest numbers look like. And I know what numbers look like when someone has arranged them to look honest. She looked at Monroe. The arrangement here was good, but it wasn't good enough for someone who knew what to look for. Across the table, Nathaniel was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. She filed it away. She would think about it later when the work was finished. If you have someone in your life who has done the quiet, invisible work of holding something together that would have collapsed without them, this is the moment to share this story with them, because Clara's story is their story too. The news reached Vivian Harrow on a Thursday, and by Friday morning a letter arrived at Ashford Hollow addressed to Nathaniel in Vivian's hand. But the letters pressed harder into the paper than usual, the lines slightly less level, the elegant control fractured at the edges in the way that reveals what is beneath. Clara left it on the library table for him without comment. He read it and brought it to her in the garden 20 minutes later. Read it, he said. She read it, standing with dirt on her gloves. The letter was 3 pages, which was itself a kind of confession, because the previous 2 had been half a page each. Vivian moved through every register she had: social graciousness, gentle concern, wounded friendship, and finally something that did not bother to dress itself as anything other than what it was. She characterized Clara as an inexperienced, socially grasping woman who had manipulated a grieving man's household accounts into a weapon against his oldest friends and business associates. She referred to the Harrow family's decades of relationship with the Ashford estate. She suggested that Nathaniel's judgment had been compromised by an inappropriate dependence on the advice of a woman with a ruined family name and a clear financial motive for destabilizing established arrangements. The last paragraph said, "I have always acted in your best interests, Nathaniel. I ask you to remember that, and to consider whether the woman currently occupying your house has any interest in you beyond the security your name provides her." Clara finished reading and handed it back. "She's frightened," Clara said. "She's attacking you. Same thing at this stage. She's trying to make you doubt me before Monroe's investigation gains momentum. If she can separate you from what I found, the case weakens." "She's wrong," Nathaniel said, and the words came out hard and immediate, not considered but certain. "I know that," Clara said. "You know that, Monroe knows that. The question is what you do with the letter." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said, "and then I know how to handle Vivian Harrow." She looked at him steadily. "Do you?" He held her gaze. "I didn't. I know that. I let her manage my affairs and my distance from this house because it was easier than feeling anything about any of it. I understand that now. I understand it because you showed me what it looked like from the outside. He set the letter on the potting table beside her. Write the letter, she said, but send a copy to Monroe first. Nathaniel's response to Vivian was 5 sentences. It stated that he had reviewed the estate accounts in full, that he had retained Judge Monroe to investigate the financial irregularities, that he had full confidence in his wife's management of Ashford Hollow during his absence, and that he would not be visiting Concord. The last sentence said, I trust you will understand that I am no longer available for private consultation on matters pertaining to my estate or my household. Clara read it and handed it back. That will end the social approach, she said. She'll move to something else. What's something else? I don't know yet. But she's not going to accept this quietly. She was right. The something else was a gathering at the Bradford estate in Concord, a late summer afternoon party to which most of notable Boston society had been invited, and to which Clara received no invitation, which was the point. Nathaniel brought the invitation to her directly and set it on the library table. She's convening her allies, he said. Yes, Clara said. And she's left me off the guest list deliberately to signal that I can be excluded, that I'm not a real Ashford, not someone who needs to be treated as your equal. What do you want to do? Clara looked at the invitation. What are your options? I could decline, he said. That confirms I've chosen your account over hers, or I could go alone. Yes, and say what? He was quiet for a moment. The truth. Clara looked at him. She weighed the risk of sending him into Vivian's orchestrated environment alone against the possibility of what he could accomplish there, that no letter, no legal proceeding, no carefully documented ledger could accomplish quite so efficiently. Social damage required social response. If you go, she said, you can't be uncertain. Not for a moment, not in front of anyone. The second they see you hesitate, she wins the room. I won't hesitate. Nathaniel, she said, and she felt him register his name the way she had registered hers. That small, precise shift in the air between two people when something changes. She's known you for years. She knows where your hesitation lives. She will go directly for it. He looked at her steadily. Ben, I need to not have any. She studied him, the set of his jaw, the directness in his eyes, the same directness that had been growing in him since the day he had walked through the front door and seen the open shutters, and he was not the man who had walked out of a church without looking back. She wasn't certain when that had changed. She suspected it had been happening gradually, since the first morning she had watched him stand in the east parlor doorway, looking at the herbs on the side table, and she had been noting it the same way. She noted everything, carefully and without premature conclusion. All right, she said, go. He left for Concord on a Saturday morning. Clara stayed at Ashford Hollow and worked. She did not pace or wait or watch the clock. She spent the morning in the library with Monroe's attorney reviewing the timber receipts, and the afternoon in the garden with Samuel, who had gotten the south wall apple trees shaped well enough that you could see the form they were heading toward, clean-lined and productive, and nothing like the tangle they had been 60 days prior. Samuel looked at the trees and said with genuine satisfaction, they'll fruit next summer. Maybe some of the strongest ones this autumn. Good, Clara said, and meant it about more than the trees. Mrs. Reed brought tea to the garden at 4 o'clock, which she had never done before, and sat down on the bench beside the garden wall without being invited, and said, You've been very careful not to want anything for yourself out of this. I've wanted the estate secured, Clara said. That's not what I mean, and you know it. Clara looked at her tea. He's a good man, Mrs. Reed said. He was a good man before grief made him absent, and he's been coming back to himself in this house, and anyone with eyes can see why. She paused. I'm not a sentimental woman, Mrs. Ashford, but I'm an honest one, and honestly, you're allowed to want something for yourself. Clara set down her teacup. She looked at the apple trees. After, she said, Mrs. Reed made a small sound that might have been exasperation and might have been affection. You and your afters, she said. Nathaniel came back Sunday evening tired but not defeated, which was the distinction that mattered. Tired the way a man looks after a hard thing done correctly. "Sit down," Clara said. He sat. "Tell me." Vivian had staged it carefully, positioning her allies and allowing the existing narrative to breathe before he arrived. The poor Nathaniel story, the troubled marriage, the grasping wife, the unfortunate business confusion. Then Nathaniel had walked directly to the center of the room, not to Vivian and not to the easiest social cluster, and had asked for the attention of the room, and had gotten it because he was Nathaniel Ashford, and he had not spoken in a social gathering with this kind of direct intention in 7 years, and people noticed. He told the room that his estate had been subjected to 4 years of unauthorized financial extraction by a firm whose principals were present in this gathering. He told them that Judge Monroe had confirmed the irregularities and that legal proceedings were underway. He told them that the investigation had been initiated by his wife, who had arrived at Ashford Hollow to find the estate accounts in a condition that should have been caught years earlier, and had not been caught because the people responsible had counted on no one looking. And then he had said, Mrs. Ashford looked. She documented everything she found, secured the estate records, contacted the appropriate legal authority, and handled the entire matter with a precision and integrity that I have never seen matched in my 20 years of business. He had looked directly at Vivian when he said the last part. I will not be taking advice on my household or my marriage from anyone who has spent 4 years treating my absence as a financial opportunity. Clara listened to all of it without speaking. When he finished, the library was quiet. What did Vivian do? Clara asked. She left the room, he said, his voice even. So did her father about 4 minutes later, and the rest of them. Monroe's in court next week. 3 of the men there today will be subpoenaed. He looked at her. The room changed when I said your name. Not all of it. Some of those people will always prefer the easier story. But enough of it. Clara pressed both hands flat on the journal. You didn't have to do it that way, she said. What way? Publicly. In that room. You could have let Monroe handle it legally and let the social narrative sort itself out gradually. I know, Nathaniel said. So why? Because she called you grasping. His voice shifted, not loud but sudden with feeling, the way a door opens unexpectedly. In a room full of people ready to believe it, she called you grasping and ambitious and said the only thing you wanted from my name was security. He looked at her directly, and every person in that room was going to carry that story back to Boston and let it sit there and harden into fact. I was not going to let that happen. Clara looked at him. She had made herself a promise on the first day, in a cold bedroom in a house she hadn't chosen, that she was not going to want things she couldn't afford to want. She had kept that promise through 6 weeks of early mornings and ledger numbers, and pulled fence posts and legal correspondence and all of it. She had kept it carefully with both hands, but she was looking at Nathaniel Ashford, who had walked into a room full of his own social world, and said her name like it meant something, and she felt the promise flex under the pressure of that. She held it anyway. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Don't thank me, she said directly, without softness. I told the truth, that's all. It wasn't all, she said, and you know it. They looked at each other across the library table with its stacks of carefully documented evidence, in the house that was breathing and lit and alive in a way it hadn't been for 7 years. Clara, he said. Nathaniel, she said it steadily. The estate first. That was the agreement. He looked at her. The estate is in Monroe's hands. I'm aware you have business in Boston. I've sent correspondence, she said, and felt something tighten in her throat. You're staying, unless you'd prefer I leave. The question sat between them, genuine and unguarded. No, she said, and then, because she had spent 6 weeks being precise, I don't prefer you leave. He nodded once, the kind of nod that contains considerably more than nodding. The dining room, he said after a moment. 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock, Clara said. He left the library. She sat still for a moment, then opened her journal to a clean page and wrote the date and the confirmed recovery sum and the status of the timber investigation and the survey confirmation. Methodical and sequential and thorough, everything in order, everything documented. At the bottom of the page she stopped. She looked at what she'd written. Then she wrote, in smaller letters, "He stayed." She closed the journal. In the kitchen, she could hear Dora starting supper. In the garden, she could hear Samuel finishing for the day. In the hall, she could hear the grandfather clock ticking, the one that had stopped at 11 minutes past 8 and stood frozen in that hour for 7 years. Nathaniel had wound it the morning after he arrived. She had not asked him to. He had simply done it. She had not written that down. Some things did not need to go in the journal. Some things were simply true. And you carried them quietly, and you let them be true without needing to document them. 2 weeks after Concord, Clara came downstairs late past 10, having lost track of time writing in her journal, and found light under the parlor door. She pushed it open. Nathaniel was sitting in the chair by the window with a book open in his lap that he was not reading. "You're awake late," he said. "Journal," she said. "I lost track." He looked at the book he wasn't reading. "I couldn't sleep." She sat down across from him, not because she had planned to, but because it was late and she was tired. And it was her parlor, and his company had stopped feeling like something she needed to manage. She tucked her feet under her in the chair, something she would not have done at the dining table, simply a person being a person late at night in a room where the formality had worn off. He watched her do it and said nothing. "The timber case," he said after a moment. Monroe's clerk wrote yesterday. The buyer's records show a fixed price arrangement going back 5 years, 1 year before the Harrow payment started. They built the whole thing in sequence, he said. "Yes," Clara said. "First, the buyer relationship that establishes the below-market receipts, then the management fee that creates the paper drain on operating funds, then the assessor visit that catalogues the documents, then the fence posts, which was going to be the last stage, the boundary dispute that would have given them legal standing to challenge the North Acreage acquisition price when the estate was finally distressed enough to sell. If I'd never come back," he said, "if you'd stayed away another 2 years, Monroe thinks the estate would have been distressed enough." Nathaniel was quiet. "I almost didn't come back," he said. "When your letter arrived in Boston, my first instinct was to send an agent." Clara looked at him. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it. "Something in how you'd written it. You didn't ask me to come. You informed me of what you'd found and told me what you intended to do about it. You wrote to me the way you would have written to anyone with a legal interest in the estate. Not like a wife writing to a husband. That's what the situation required," Clara said. "I know," he said. "That's why I came. You wrote to me the way the situation required and it woke something up." Clara held very still. "I'm not good at this," he said. Not apologetically, but directly. "I was. Before, I knew how to be present in my own life, and then Eleanor died and I left, not the house myself. And I stayed gone long enough that I nearly lost everything she and I had built together because I was too buried in grief to notice what was happening around me." Clara said nothing. She let him have the space to say it. "She would have hated it," he said. "Eleanor had no patience for absence. She believed you showed up or you didn't. And if you didn't, you had no right to the things that required showing up." He looked at the book in his lap. "You reminded me of her when I first came back, not in look or manner." Clara felt something move through her, complicated and quiet. "I'm not Eleanor," she said. "No," he said immediately. "I know that. I want to be clear about that." He looked at her directly. "You're entirely yourself. That's what I mean. She was entirely herself, and you're entirely yourself, and I had forgotten what that looked like. What it felt like to be in a room with someone who is entirely, stubbornly, uncomplicatedly themselves." The fire had burned low. The parlor was warm and quiet, and the clock in the hall ticked its steady, recovered tick. "Nathaniel," she said. "I know," he said. The estate, first. The estate is nearly settled. He looked at her. Nearly. Give Monroe 2 more weeks, she said. Let the proceedings reach a stable point. And then, she held his gaze. And then we can talk about the rest. He nodded. The clock ticked. Neither of them moved to leave. They sat in the parlor until past midnight, talking not about the estate or the accounts or Vivian or Monroe or the North Acreage line. They talked about his mother who had planted the herb garden. They talked about Clara's father who had taught her double-entry bookkeeping at a kitchen table when she was 12, and called it the most honest language in the world because numbers could not be made to mean something they didn't. They talked about Eleanor without pain, or rather with a pain that had been properly placed, set down in the correct corner of the room where it belonged rather than spread across everything. They talked about the apple trees and Samuel, and the way Dora's bread had gotten better since someone had started telling her it was good. They talked until the fire was nothing but coals. And then they said good night and went upstairs, and Clara lay in the dark with her hands folded and felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashford Hollow, that she was not managing a situation. She was living in one. Monroe's formal findings arrived on a Tuesday morning. 31 pages that Clara read at the library table, while Nathaniel sat across from her, reading his own copy in the quiet of the house, with the apple leaves moving outside the window and the sound of her own steady breathing. The findings confirmed every number she had calculated, confirmed the uncontracted payments and the below-market timber sales and the coordinated acquisition strategy, and the assessor's visit from a man who turned out not to be from the assessor's office at all. The total sum of recoverable funds was significant. The legal exposure for the Harrow family's business interests was, in Monroe's careful language, substantial. On page 22, Monroe had included a formal finding regarding the role of estate management in the investigation. A paragraph stating that the irregularities had been identified and documented by Mrs. Clara Ashford, whose meticulous records had formed the evidentiary foundation of the entire proceeding. She read the paragraph twice. She looked up and found Nathaniel watching her. Page 22, she said. I read it, he said. He didn't need to include that. He included it because it's true and because it belonged in the record. Nathaniel set his copy down. Monroe is a precise man. He documents. What happened? What happened is that you found it. Clara looked back at the page. She thought about the 3rd morning at Ashford Hollow, when she had sat at the kitchen table before sunrise, with a lamp and a ledger and a feeling that something in the numbers was wrong. She thought about the letter in the linen cupboard and the fence posts pulled from the north line, and Gerald Pratt's smile and Vivian's first letter in its gracious blade tone. She thought about Monroe's clerk writing worthy of review and what it had felt like to read those 2 words after weeks of working entirely alone. She had not expected anyone to put her name in a formal legal document. She had not been working toward that. But Monroe had put her name in the record, and it was there now, permanent, in the kind of document that gets filed and kept and referenced, and she felt the weight of that in a way she had not anticipated. Clara, Nathaniel said. She looked up. Come here, he said. It was not a command. It was an ask, quiet and direct from a man who had learned over the past weeks the difference between the two. She stood and walked around the table, and they were close in the way that 2 people are close when the careful distance they have been maintaining stops being necessary. I owe you an apology, he said. You've apologized. Not properly. He looked at her steadily. I married you and sent you away and called it done. I gave you a cold house and empty rooms and a letter with 3 sentences and no signature. I left you alone with a household full of strangers and an estate someone was actively stealing from, and I stayed in Boston and let myself believe that distance was the same as dealing with things. His voice was even, but she could hear what was underneath it. That was wrong. It was wrong before you found the accounts, and wrong before Monroe, and wrong before Concord. It was wrong the day I walked out of that church. Yes, she said. It was. He did not wince at the confirmation. She had known he wouldn't, because she had been watching him for weeks and she had seen what he was made of underneath the 7 years of absence, and it was good material. It was the kind of material worth building something with. I can't undo it, he said. No, Clara said, but you can show up from here. She looked at him, the full attention look she gave to things that mattered. And she looked at the man who had wound the clock every morning and walked the North Acreage boundary and spoken her name in a room full of people waiting to dismiss her. And she looked at him with the same clarity she had brought to every ledger she had ever read, and what she saw was sufficient. Showing up, she said, is the whole of it. That's all it ever is. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, simply took it the way you take the hand of someone you have decided you are not going to let go of, and she let him. Monroe's formal settlement came through in October, and with it came a brief, final note at the bottom of the letter after his signature, the most informal thing Clara had ever seen him write. The estate records of Ashford Hollow, Monroe wrote, are now among the most thoroughly documented in 3 counties. Should you ever find yourself without occupation, the legal profession would welcome your particular skills. Clara laughed, genuinely and fully, in the way she had not laughed in a long time, and handed the letter across the breakfast table to Nathaniel, who read the postscript and smiled, an actual unguarded smile that changed his whole face into something she had suspected was under there and was glad to finally see. He's not wrong, Nathaniel said. I have sufficient occupation, Clara said. Do you? He set the letter down. What would you say your occupation is, precisely? She looked around the kitchen at Dora moving efficiently at the stove, at the garden visible through the window where Samuel was already working, at the sound of William in the stable, at Mrs. Reed's footsteps on the floor above, at the clock in the hall, at the man across the table, who had wound it this morning as he wound it every morning, and would wind it tomorrow. I'm the woman who keeps Ashford Hollow running, she said. That's one way to put it, Nathaniel said. What's another? He looked at her with the full attention look she had first catalogued in the East Parlour on day 3 and had been accumulating evidence about ever since. Home, he said. You're the reason this place is home. Clara picked up her coffee. She held his gaze over the rim. We both are, she said. That's the point. September had come to Ashford Hollow and then October, and the apple trees along the south wall were doing what Samuel had predicted, 11 of the 28 setting fruit. Small and early but real and present, growing on branches that 6 months ago had been so tangled in neglect that Clara had not been certain they could be saved. She stood in the garden on a Thursday morning and looked at those 11 trees, and heard Nathaniel come through the garden gate behind her, knowing his step now the way she knew every step in the house, the particular weight and rhythm of it, the way it dipped from Samuel's and William's, and every other set of footsteps she had learned in this place. He came to stand beside her. 11, she said. Samuel told me. He seemed pleased. He should be. He did most of the work. He said you told him which branches to cut and which to keep. I read about it, Clara said. My father had a book on orchard management. He bought it when he thought he might buy land upstate. He never did, but I read the book. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Your father. He was a good man who made a bad investment and lost nearly everything, and spent the last 5 years of his life trying to manage the gap between what he'd had and what he had left. She said it without self-pity, simply as fact as she said most things. He taught me the accounts because he said a woman who understood numbers would never be entirely without resources. He was right. He sounds like he was someone worth knowing. He was, she said. He would have liked this house. Nathaniel said quietly, I'm glad you're in it. She turned and looked at him in the clear morning, with the garden full of everything they had put into it. I wrote to my sister last week, she said, in Philadelphia. I told her I was staying. You hadn't told her before. I hadn't decided before. She met his eyes. I've decided now. He looked at her for a long moment. Clara, he said, when I came back to this house, I told myself I was coming for the estate. That was true. But it stopped being the whole truth somewhere around the third day, when I walked into the east parlor and found you at the desk, and you didn't look up or adjust yourself or perform anything. You just said, "Is there something you need?" and went back to work. And I thought, there is a person who is entirely at home in herself, in my house, in a situation she didn't choose, managing things she had no obligation to manage, and she is entirely at home in herself. He looked at her. I have not been at home in myself for 7 years, and I watched you be that every single day, and it pulled me back. Clara said nothing for a moment, because she was a person who did not speak before she was ready, and she needed to be ready for this. "Nathaniel," she said, "I came here with one trunk and a piece of paper listing my legal rights as a married woman under Massachusetts statute, because I needed to know what I had and what I didn't. I didn't have warmth. I didn't have welcome. I didn't have a husband who looked at me, or a house that was alive, or a single reason to believe this was going to be anything other than what it looked like. A cold arrangement between two people who needed something from each other and called it a marriage." "I know," he said, "but I stayed," she said. "Not because I had no choice. I had choices. I could have handled the legal matter through correspondence and lived in this house as a competent stranger, and called that sufficient." She held his gaze. "I stayed because somewhere in the second week I looked at this house and thought, this is worth saving. And somewhere in the fourth week I looked at you and thought the same thing." He exhaled, that slow breath she had heard before, the breath of a man setting down a weight. "I don't know how to be someone's husband the way it ought to be done," he said. "I knew once. I've been away from it long enough that I'm not certain the knowledge is still where I left it." "You wound the clock," she said. He looked at her. "What? Every morning since the first day you arrived, you wound the grandfather clock. 7 years it stood at 11 minutes past 8, and you came back and you wound it." She looked at him steadily. "That's how I knew." "Knew what?" he said. "That you were capable of noticing a stopped thing and doing the small work of starting it again. That's the whole skill, Nathaniel. That's all love ever is, noticing what stopped and doing the daily work of keeping it going." He reached out and took her face in his hands, with the full present tense attention of a man who has finally, completely shown up. "I'm going to do it right this time," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to hold you to it." He kissed her in the garden with 11 apple trees, putting out their first recovered fruit along the south wall, and the house breathing behind them with every window open, and the clock ticking in the hall in the morning, full and clear, and entirely present around them both. Outside, the October morning was turning the apple leaves gold along the south wall, and the house that had been cold and sealed and silent for 7 years was full of the ordinary, irreplaceable sounds of people who had chosen each other and chosen this place and intended to stay. Every window was open, the light came through, the clock in the hall kept perfect time. Ashford Hollow was not a cold estate given to an unwanted wife. It was a home that two people had built back from the bones, one window at a time, one true account at a time, one wound clock and one recovered tree, and one honest word at a time. And it would remain a home for every year that came after, because the people inside it had learned, at some cost and with full clarity, that love is not a feeling that arrives and stays on its own. It is a choice made daily in the small, deliberate acts of those who refuse to leave broken things broken. Clara Ashford had known that from the first morning she opened the first window, and now finally so did he. If this story moved you, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another. Drop your city in the comments, because I want to see how far Clara's story travels. And if you know someone who is quietly doing the invisible work of holding something together that would fall apart without them, share this with them today. Because they deserve to know that their story has an ending, worth staying for.